So at this stage, I'd like to welcome to the podium our former LAZ President, Madam Ms. Linda Kasonde, to discuss what key provisions she would, in relation to governance and constitutionalism. And if you might focus on those Landilani has not traversed so far. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I want to first start with saying that I listened to the airing of the meeting between the president, the Republican president, and civil society the other day. And one thing struck me about the president's remarks. He seemed to be suggesting that the criticism of Bill 7 was somehow a personal attack against him individually. And I think, as State Council has rightly pointed out, the criticisms of Bill 7 are far from being personal. They're actually rooted in the Constitution, and specifically, as State Council has said, in Article 61 with regards to our lawmakers' duty to answer to the people who put them in office, and Article 90, which requires the president to exercise his executive functions in the best interests of us as citizens. Power derives from the people, and I think we often forget that as citizens. History has taught us many times that we are so powerful. We saw it with the movement for multi-party democracy. We saw it with the campaign against the third-term bid by President Chiluba. And we saw it not once, but twice with Bill 10. And so we know our power, and we need to be reminded of it. And that is essentially what has caused this back down by the government to allow broader consultations, which are most welcome. But I'll get to what I think about the issue of deferment a bit later in my presentation. So Mr. Sangwa talked about the fact that when a process of constitutional reform or amendments is being undertaken, it must always be done in the interests of the citizens. And so to point to an issue that Landilani has not raised, I'll point to the issue of the increase in the number of MPs. So as he highlighted, the number of elected seats would increase to 211. And then there'd be an additional 20 seats for women, an additional 20 seats for youth, and 3 for persons with disabilities. In total, that's an additional 90 seats, I believe, somewhere around there. And if you look, indeed, from 156 to 211, plus 20, plus 20, plus 3, it's about 90 seats. Now, members of parliament, I think, on average, I think the vice president earns about 2.4 million, and the lowest paid MP earns 1.2 million, somewhere thereabouts. And at the end of parliament, these MPs get a gratuity. That gratuity is 35% of the gross annual emoluments multiplied by the number of years that the MP has been in office. And they get paid tax-free. Just to illustrate how much that is, in 2023, the gratuity for MPs was 498 million kwacha. It was subsequently increased in the budget to 1 billion in 2024. So that's for the existing 156 MPs. Now try increasing that by a good 57 to 60%. That's the cost of how much it will pay to pay not only the emoluments, but also the gratuity of MPs. How is that in the best interest of this nation? A nation grappling with public debt, a nation grappling with poverty, a nation in which many people are struggling to find employment. Just think about that. Now, I won't talk about the issue of by-elections, but just to touch on it briefly. Not only is democracy expensive, it is necessary because it reflects the will of the people. And the will of a political party is not necessarily the will of the people. And so our democratic rights are being taken away from us by the party selecting who the candidate will be in the event of a vacancy. Not only that, it can also lead to the unintended consequence of validly and democratically elected candidates being forced out of office by their political party and replaced by somebody who they think is more convenient to their interests. Now, as the only woman on the panel out of 6 speakers, including the moderator, whatever the number is, I feel a duty to specifically talk about gender inclusion and why it's important. On Wednesday, I launched my book, Thoughts on Democracy and Womanhood. And what I wanted to do by writing that book was to illustrate the link between democracy and gender inclusion. And for me, nowhere is that better illustrated than the story I told in my first book, which is that narrated by the Swedish foreign minister. And she talks about 2 warring factions fighting over a river on a map. And they're fighting and they can't seem to resolve the issue. And then finally they introduce women to the conversation. And the women point out that the river on the map has dried up many years ago. And so they're fighting over nothing. But how did the women know that? They knew that because they're the ones who went to draw water from the river. They're the ones who do the cleaning, the laundry, the cooking. And so their lived experience enables those warring factions to resolve their disputes. And that is the power of bringing gender inclusivity in decision-making in our country. And in fact, at the very same occasion of my launch, Elias Chipimo made the comment that perhaps if more women were involved in the decision-making around the current impasse on our former Republican president's funeral, perhaps this issue would have been put to bed a long time ago. The other issue I'd like to make mention of with regards to the proposals in Bill 10 for only 20 seats to be taken up by women. Why is this important? On the panel today, as I mentioned, we've got 5 men, and they have all very different lived experiences. Some have experienced rural life, others urban. Some, they're very well educated. They've experienced affluence and at different times of their lives, maybe lack. And yet I'm one woman, a fraction of the population, here to represent so many different lived experiences of so many different women. And that doesn't seem fair to me. It is not, it's incumbent on us to really realize that women have a place in our society. And it's not enough to have 1 or 2, because we have different experiences. And just to mention a number of issues that you're leaving to the men in parliament to resolve on behalf of women are things like period poverty, things like maternal and child health, things like education for your children, things like gender-based violence and the defilement of your children. Now, if we don't have enough women at the table making decisions about our own lives, we're missing out. We're really missing out. Just to conclude on the issue of the decision by the president to request the Minister of Justice to defer the debate on Bill 7, I think we need to be very cautiously optimistic. On the one hand, it shows that government is responding to the people's opposition to Bill 7. On the other hand, there is a possibility that it could be used as a cover for legitimizing Bill 7. And I'll explain this by illustrating the other bills where this has happened. In other words, the government's track record on making promises to make more progressive laws. So, for example, the government told the people of Zambia that when it came into office in 2021, that it would repeal and replace the Cyber Security and Cyber Crimes Act and replace it with a more progressive law that is in line with our Constitution. That law has been repealed and replaced, but with a far more regressive law that has sent a chill down the spine of citizens and the media. Not only that, this government also told us that the NGO Act, which was enacted in 2009, would also be repealed and reformed to be more progressive and in line with democratic norms. This is a law that threatens to constrain the roles and activities of civil society. And we all know how powerful civil society is and what a threat it can potentially be to the government. So now this government is in office, there is a proposed NGO bill which threatens to restrict civil society, similar to what we've seen in Zimbabwe and other countries in the region. This is not progress. And of course, there were utterances or statements rather by the Minister of Information, Cornelius Mweetwa, some, I think, year or two ago, that the statutory regulation of media would also be removed, that they wouldn't do it. And now he's come back and said, it's a possibility, it's there on the table. And that again will restrict citizens' access to credible and independent information, and therefore freedom of expression. We saw the same thing with the Access to Information Bill. So there is a track record here. Should we trust the government to do the right thing in terms of Bill 7? Again, as State Council has called upon all of you, it is incumbent on us to keep the pressure to ensure that our voice is heard. Bill 10 should never be on the table. It should be removed. And I think, as we've been calling for in civil society for several years, any constitutional reform process must be people-driven and not government-driven. And again, our lawmakers are not a law unto themselves. They are the servants of the people, as is the president. And so we get to tell the government what we want to see in our Constitution. So I'll end there. We've definitely made some progress. We've pushed the government into deferring the bill, but it's not over. It's far from over. We need to push and make sure that Bill 7 never sees the light of day. Thank you very much, everyone.